Cities After is a bi-monthly podcast about the future of cities. Grounded in our daily urban struggles, it is part dystopian and part utopian. My intention is to entice your civic imagination into action, because we know that a more just and sustainable urban future is possible. This is Miguel Robles-Duran, and I dare you to imagine our cities after.
COVID, global warming, gentrification,
homelessness,
racism,
colonialism,
patriarchy,
hunger,
police brutality,
Private property. Capitalism. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. Leilani Farha is a Canadian human rights lawyer and the former United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Housing, as well as the Global Director of The Shift. Her work is animated by the principle that housing is a social good and not a commodity. Leilani has helped develop human rights standards on the right to housing through her topical reports on homelessness, the financialization of housing, informal settlements, right-based housing strategies, and the first United Nations guidelines for the implementation of the right to housing. She is the central character in the documentary The Push regarding the financialization of housing, which is currently screening around the world. Leilani launched The Shift in 2017 with the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the United Cities and Local Government. Hello, Leilani. It's really a pleasure to have you in the podcast. I first wanted to touch about you launched The Shift, right? It was 2019, if I remember well. And this is a global movement that came out of you doing work as a UN rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. And in this shift, basically, you try to claim something that your life's work has been on, which is human rights, human right to housing, encouraging governments and businesses and so on to use a lot their capital not to profit, but to actually provide proper facilities so that people can live in dignity, raise families and so forth. I also want to talk a little bit about how it was to record your documentary. There's a documentary also that you made around The Shift, so that we can start discussing a few of the topics that you touch in there and get more close into the topic of COVID and housing markets and everything that's been going on in the previous year. But I wonder if you can tell me a little bit how The Shift came out and what was it? How was it? How did it develop?
Sure. First of all, thanks, Miguel, for inviting me on your relatively new podcast. I appreciate very much being in conversation with you. And when we first met, I knew we had a lot to talk about, and I'm super happy that even in the midst of a pandemic, we're still talking. So it's cool. The Shift. So, I never really wanted to start an organization. And so The Shift, we try to keep it away from the idea of it being an organization. I view it more as a movement, and a movement that's necessary at this point in time in our political economic history. And the reason I say that is because when I became rapporteur in 2014, I'd been paying attention to what was happening around the world with respect to housing, but, as rapporteur, you become incredibly immersed and you're just eating, breathing, sleeping, housing, and you're learning so much, and not just about one country, but of course, the global context. And what I saw very clearly, very early on, I saw two things. Everywhere I would go, I would look up and I would see cranes, skyscrapers, luxury, towers in the sky, everywhere, whether I was in India or whether I was in San Francisco. And then at the same time, the second thing I would see, I would look down and I would see people living on pavements, in tents, under bridges, in squalor, with no water, no sanitation, no toilets, etc. And it was the gap between what I was seeing on the ground and what I was seeing up in the sky that I wanted to understand. What was this gap? How had it been created? And what I learned really quickly was that everywhere, in every nook and cranny of every city, housing was being treated as a commodity. It had become the hottest the newest asset class. All sorts of different types of housing had become asset classes, like student housing, for example. And the idea of housing as home, a place to grow a family, refuge from the big bad world, that seemed to have lost its currency. And it dawned on me quite early on in my mandate that we really needed to shift things. And so from there eventually came the idea, okay, let's create a global movement. And I will say I went to one of those big world conferences that I hate. It was Habitat 3. It was in Quito, Ecuador.
Yeah, we were both there.
Yes, exactly. We didn't meet each other. We didn't know each other, unfortunately.
No.
A lost opportunity. Think of the coffee we could have had together.
Yeah, there's good coffee there.
Exactly. In any event, it was there that we decided to sort of test the idea. So in partnership with the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So that's quite a separate body from me when I was UN Rapporteur. It's like a secretariat. It's its own human rights body. Together with them, as well as an international network of cities called United Cities and Local Government, we decided to host an event at this big world conference. And they asked us for a title, so we just called it The Shift. And then we said we wanted to talk about the right to housing. We ended up using the opportunity to invite as many different groups and stakeholders as we could to that meeting. We were just putting flyers. I mean, you know, these world conferences, it's impossible to get people to come to your event because everyone's competing. So we were just putting flyers and telling people, etc. We ended up with a sold out, as they say, standing room only. More than 200 people were there, or approximately 200 people were there. And there were grassroots movements, and there were academics, and there were advocates, and city governments, and national governments, and grant makers. And everyone agreed we needed to do something at the global level to address the uber commodification of housing. And so the idea of the shift was born, and from there it was, administrative and trying to figure out how to really create a movement and how to use the rapporteurship in my final years to really grow a movement and create some momentum. And that's where the film Push comes in.
Yeah, I was going to ask about it because after that, of course, I mean, you thought that it would be good to make it more accessible, right? To make people understand what has been going on with financialization.
That's right. That's right. And one of the things I'd been told when I started to be rapporteur was I was doing presentations and people were telling me, you have a good way of communicating human rights law. You don't make it technical. You make it accessible. You make it friendly. You make it fun even, some people said. I couldn't believe it. And I realized that one, that was a strength of mine, and two, that we need that this isn't rocket science. The human right to housing is so fundamental and so basic and really simple, right? What is the human right to housing? The right to live in dignity and with security. It's simple. And so I really felt compelled to use the privileged position as rapporteur and my ability to communicate fairly clearly and to really use that to help ignite this shift that I felt was so necessary and that others feel is so necessary. It was serendipity, to be honest, Miguel. I got a direct tweet from a Swedish documentary filmmaker who's highly regarded, Fredrik Gertten. He'd made many movies, won many awards, and he happened to be concerned with the same thing that you and I are concerned with. Who are cities for? Why is the rent too damn high? How come no one can afford to live in our cities, whether in the global north or the global south? And so he approached me. It was, quite independently, and he said he wanted to make this film. And even though most people around me didn't think it was a good idea to add to my work as rapporteur, being followed around by a film crew for 2 years, and the intensity of that kind of project, I decided to do it exactly for the reason that you named, which is I knew it was just this opportunity to get the word out, to get people to talk about these issues and engage them in a way that would make sense to them. I mean, film, right? Film.
Sure.
It's so accessible.
Sure.
So we made Push the film.
And it has been watched around the world and continues to be watched. I still get, notifications that your film is screening here, is screening there. And it has been actually an incredibly helpful instrument. I mean, when I was it 2014, I was working on an exhibition for the Museum of Modern Art. And one of the decisions that we took was actually to make a film on housing. And seeing exactly what was happening in New York City during the Bloomberg years, which was the same thing that you describe, is cranes everywhere, luxury housing mostly. I mean, basically there was no other kind of housing being made. And that housing that they used to call affordable, it was clearly not affordable. And there was a lot of mobilization, and film is always a very good way to get in touch with an audience. And one of the things that we're trying to do with this podcast, and I know that you also have a podcast, is precisely to get the word around so that we can be more informed and also coalesce in some kind of like movement like yours, right? And I think that is incredibly important to do. Now, I had been talking in the previous podcast a lot about the conditions of housing during the pandemic, which is very distinct than the time that we both made our little sort of documentary. Well, in your case, your film, I did a little documentary, which was pure neoliberal capital. It was, basically a lot of finance capital trying to put their money somewhere else, which is, in most cases, urbanization. During the pandemic, things have actually shifted, in my view, and I wanted to get your opinions and also what is your view on what have you sensed have been the differences? You continue to work in the housing space, and can you tell me a little bit about what has it been for you working on these during the pandemic?
Yeah, it's such a good question. Have things changed since the pandemic in my area and housing as a human right? How have they changed? I feel it's such a mixed bag, to be honest, because I'm operating at the global level and I'm sort of, watching what's happening everywhere. I feel it's uneven. And even within a particular city or a particular country, it seems uneven. I keep saying it seems to me that some governments are adopting a ping pong approach. They ping and then they pong, and it goes. Something good happens and then they retract, and something bad happens. But I was pleased to see at the beginning of the pandemic that in many Western developed nations, governments were suddenly keyed into the fact that, wait, we have a stay-at-home order, and that's our only prescription against this deadly virus, and we have people living in homelessness on our streets. That those two things don't work together. And so in many places like London, parts of the United States, in Canada, there was swift movement to move people from homelessness into hotels, for example. Yes. So that's cool. What I didn't see, though, is a real shift in a new understanding that people living in homelessness are rights holders, that they are entitled to long-term housing options, that they aren't criminals, that they aren't just charity cases and drug addicts. I haven't seen that, a real shift like that. In the global south, I did see some governments, for example, recognizing that water and sanitation really needs to be provided to informal settlements, that people can't exist without water and sanitation, and that in the midst of a pandemic, that's really key. So I saw, for example, in Nigeria, of all places, the informal settlements are horrible there, some of the worst I visited. And I saw some movement where food was being brought in and water, for example. But again, not that kind of entrenched, lasting change that we,
more like an emergency.
That's right.
Sort of
almost
scenario,
humanitarian.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is what we have been seeing during almost every crisis of the last 40 years of neoliberalism. And we have some kind of crisis, and there's a lot of help, solidarity, etc. And then we go back to some kind of whatever you want to call normal.
Precisely. And Miguel, I mean, we're talking about financialization and in this podcast, and one of the things that has been very disheartening for me is the complete lack of engagement by most governments on the issue of the fact that properties are up for sale. Not just distressed. A lot of people are feeling like we should get rid of property. And no government that I can see is really paying attention to the fact that the big financial actors are chomping at the bit. This for them, they said it. I've heard in various news media, they've said this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to make money off of property. And just last week, I heard one of the head honchos at Blackstone, one of the largest private equity firm in the world, saying that residential real estate is absolutely part of their strategy right now. So they are eyeing all of the properties that are out there, distressed and otherwise, and are ready to pick up residential real estate. So they're already very active in the United States since the pandemic struck. So worrying. I mean,
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things that I was talking in the monologue, that it seems to be that a lot of finance capital, it's becoming even more predatory during this period than what it was in the after the 2008 financial crisis, right? One of the things I discussed, Leilani, is that there's so much money that was made over the last year, right? Which is these disparities of wealth that we've seen, which are like beyond any sort of imaginary in reality. Just I think in the United States, there were like 40 billionaires made over the last year, and that's during the pandemic. And so you have a lot of money around. Several trillions were made during this. And, as we know, I mean, that money tends to go directly into forms of urbanization. Now, on that aspect, we also have a lot of people in distress, and we have a lot of people that, as you're saying, about to go homeless, losing their property because unemployment, because, loss of economic opportunity. And so these two somehow are clashing in something we've never seen before, I think. I don't know if that's what, yeah.
I completely agree with you. I completely agree. I heard a statistic the other day that during the first year of the pandemic, a new billionaire came onto the scene, a new billionaire was made every 17 hours. In other words, 500 new billionaires. And at the same time, the World Bank has said, as a result of the pandemic, there will be a new 150 million people living in extreme poverty. And extreme poverty is like $1.65 US a day. Right?
Yeah.
So I completely agree with you. Just this complete, what do you call that? Like polarization. And so much of this, Miguel, is about real estate. And that's where I will say, one of the things I like about you is you've embraced this area very, you're there, you understand it, you are an urbanist and you see it. I find a lot of the discussions around wealth inequality and, gross inequality in societies does not talk about the role that real estate plays. It's not just a consequence of inequality to live in homelessness. It's not just a consequence. Real estate and financialization of housing is a driver of inequality. And that's part of the work I'm trying to do, is to get people to realize it plays a huge role. It's a huge role in GDPs. It's a huge role in how corrupt money flows and where it flows and how it flows. So I think we were talking about, have we seen change since the pandemic struck? And I think we've seen that neoliberalism does not respond well to crisis.
Yes,
right? That it doesn't
absolutely.
work in crisis, and
Yeah.
governments have stepped up and stepped in. So that's good. That's cool. That's new, right? After years and years of this neoliberal heavy-handedness, whatever they would say, there's no hand, but whatever. And so that's new, but I'm just not sure that that government stepping in has reached this issue of financialization. It's getting there, right? I mean, in the States, they're talking about wealth taxes, for example. Argentina as well.
Which is very, very new situation, which also has caught us a lot by surprise. I mean, we were not expecting that level of progressive politics to be at the center, right? And what we had seen during, for example, the Trump administration or many other sort of neo-fascist sort of directions or governments around the world has been boosting the idea that the economy is fine because the GDP is fine. And then again, we're talking about specific indicators, right? I mean, I cannot forget the many times that was said that, you know, the economy is doing great. And you guys like, what economy, right? I mean, I see people like in the streets dying of hunger. And at the same time, as you say, you know, it's like all these billionaires going in there. So it also sounds like, the indicators that we have, you mentioned the World Bank. I mean, you worked at the United Nations. There's all kinds of indicators that get fabricated all the time. But yes, it seems that there is no sort of place to put the financialization, the housing markets, the real estate operations, because in many cases, most of these operations are on a global scale, right? And most of the indicators that we have operate at a local or national level, right? In order to direct like how Germany's economy is, Japan economy or Nigeria or Mexico, etc. But when we're talking about financial investments, I mean, heavy capital, we're talking about, global capital that is very difficult to grasp, in terms of indicators. It's almost like we have lost that, the way of dealing with that scale, or we have never been able so far to indicate it. Have you been working in the development, or like what kind of indicators do you think they need to be pushed, or that you've been pushing?
It's super tough, and I think you described why it's so tough very well. The global flow of money, it's so hard to trace. There's no warm bodies behind it. It's shell company after shell company after offshore company. And so there is an intangible nature to all of this in a way. So one of the things I've noticed is there has been more movement, in particular by data journalists who are trying to map cities, who owns our cities. So again, it's not at that global scale, but just recently, 25 journalists from across Europe came together and really tried to do a mapping exercise. And why I love that is if we want to hold people to account, we need to know who are we holding accountable. Absolutely. And I mean, I, of course, with human rights law, I hold governments accountable, but I need to be able to say to governments, okay, governments, you need to hold the following third parties to account. And so we need the data. So that's a really important move. And I mean, Berliners started it, but then it's now evolved. And in fact, on my own podcast, we interviewed one of the data journalists from Athens. Just incredible things that have happened in Athens, terrible, since the global financial crisis. I heard about low-income community. 70% of the population in Athens in this low-income community has been displaced since the global financial crisis. And displaced by what? Airbnb. Yes. Airbnb. I mean, and then, you don't know the beneficial owner of Airbnb, who owns those units. So, but there is a real need, and it's part of why we started the shift. There is a need to get a handle on this at global level. And I would like to see the UN itself do more work in this area. Not necessarily my successor, the rapporteur, because rapporteurs can only do so much as independent experts. But I think there are other mechanisms within the UN to start holding governments accountable to this. And I'd like to see more movement there. But, in terms of indicators, one of the things that I found myself having to wade into that's so complicated for some. I have to say, like, I'm a human rights lawyer. I don't know macroeconomics. I never studied it. I don't know. Everything I know, I've just learned by reading. But I've had to become very familiar with monetary policy and then fiscal policy and the interaction between those. And not to get too boring, but we know during the pandemic, monetary policy has been set such that interest rates are low, and quantitative easing, and listeners don't even need to know what that is. Just know that governments are printing money and they're flooding the economy with money. They're buying bonds and they're putting money into the economy. And while that might be great for jobs, it might be great for business. It might allow for loans for business, for more research, for hiring more people, for developing, growing. It is also very good for financial actors in the real estate sector. And they're using these monetary policies to their advantage, as we discussed, right? They're going to go on shopping sprees. They're already going on shopping sprees.
They're already doing that.
Yeah. And so what in terms, I don't know if this is really indicators, but it's certainly something I'm looking at, is that relationship. I mean, governments or central banks, the Fed in the US, for example, or the Bank of Canada, may have good reason to take the monetary policy they did in the midst of this pandemic. I'm not necessarily querying it. I don't have the skills to query it anymore, but then just to say I realize it has an impact on real estate, it makes it very attractive. But don't governments have a responsibility to make sure fiscal policy is in place to protect low-income tenants who are just renting average apartments, who don't want their building bought?
The average population, the majority of inhabitants, to protect them, right? In terms with these kinds of fiscal policy issues. I mean, that thing that you're discussing, it reminds me of a practice that has been a lot on the news recently, especially because of these shopping sprees that companies like Blackstone have been doing. In New York, it's being said that there are sort of, I don't know, some people, organizations that are buying over hundreds of units. Mostly luxury, but also all kinds of units around because they're empty, right? And that practice of warehousing comes from money that it's used in order to buy an asset, but also to keep the value of an asset. And it does not matter if it's occupied or not, right? And I think that's also heralding some kind of other major sort of responsibilities from the side of the governments of how are you going to deal with that? Because we have come to an era or to a period of capitalism where you can own property and you don't need to have it occupied in order for you to make money out of it. So the purpose in previous decades, I would say, before perhaps neoliberal times, I mean, if you own property, you want to rent it, you want to, do something with it. We're arriving to this time where it's not necessary. You just hold the asset and you can use all kinds of financial instruments in order to actually profit from that asset, right? Even though it can remain empty. So a lot of questions have appeared, what will be the future of urbanization of cities if these instruments and these sort of monetary politics that are being utilized for buying hundreds and hundreds of properties continue to empty out the cities even more than what the pandemic has already done, from its economic impact, right? And it makes me aware a bit of what a lot of environmentalists are saying, that we might actually need a global agency, right, rather than sort of a national agency, because this is, as we said, global capital. I don't know if you have in your talks or you've met people that have been trying to organize something at a very global level that has a level of agency over governments. I know that sounds impossible. Not even the UN can do it. But it seems that we have reached the issue where this might be the only way out. I don't know.
Well, funnily enough, when I wrote in 2017 my thematic report on the financialization of housing, so it was just a research report, but it was the first time I really got deep into this issue. One of the recommendations that I came up with was that there should be some global entity created to deal with this. And I knew at the time that if that was going to have legs, I would probably have to create those legs. And I didn't. I haven't yet. So it's a good question. And should something new be created, or is there a way to harness an existing thing? And I think that's a good question and very relevant for right now. I think you might be right that the only way to really deal with this is at global level. And I don't know of an existing structure that could work that isn't already embedded in the system that is, in fact, causing the problem. So, World Trade Organization, for example. So, I think that's interesting to think through how we might make that happen. Maybe that's a project,
this
Miguel.
is very enticing. That is a project, Leilani. That is a project. And I'm glad that we're coming to an end of the podcast with some enticing the imagination of our audience, because I think part of it is that we have to force ourselves to think ways out. And this might sound like a titanic task to begin to structure some kind of global entity to deal with the right to housing. I mean, because it's ultimately about this. It's like, feeling that, or knowing that every single human has a right to shelter, and a proper shelter, right? Not anything like that. And if we really want to achieve that, then something very radical needs to change or be created in this direction. And I think this is a very good way of sort of entering into these final stages with the last question for you. Besides this, Leilani, besides imagining the possibility of a global organization that oversees, how fiscal capital is used in housing. What other things would you say are necessary for us to do in the coming year, in the coming months, to deal or to confront, the housing issues that we're facing?
Well, it's so hard to go from this sort of dream and vision that we've created down to something very practical, but I will.
Yes.
So I'm working right now on a set of human rights directives on the financialization of housing, with a view to helping governments and advocates and tenants movements in understanding the various manifestations of financialization. Because you and I have only touched on a few, Airbnb and this idea of, mass purchasing, etc. But there's lots of other ways in which housing has been financialized. So the directives are descriptive in that they talk about the various ways financialization happens, and then they are directive in that they provide recommendations as to how we can curb this or really shift the paradigm and shift how housing is being treated. And I go from everything zoomed out, like from very zoomed out recommendations, like every government, whether city level or national level, should have a human rights-based housing strategy that looks not just at housing policy, but looks at finance. Right to more micro things like regulate Airbnb and do it like this. And, so what I'm hoping is that I can get these into the public domain. I can popularize them the way I like to, get a whole bunch of different stakeholders to endorse them, and get some governments to start using them.
That sounds like that's a great to conclude. And I hope that you actually manage and that you have a lot of help around. Right?
I do. And I will prey on that help.
Yes. Yeah. We can do things together and with other people too. I hope that you join for more conversations in the future. I really planning to have you as a periodical invitee. You're always fantastic, right? And it's always a pleasure and honor to talk to you.
Likewise.
Really, thank you very much, Leilani. And we see each other soon.
I hope so. Thanks so much, Miguel. Love talking with you.
This was another episode of Cities After. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe.